That's it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You should never applaud until you hear the speaker first.
Oh, we know you, Dave.
You might not like how things turn out.
Excellent.
Well, for those of you who don't know me, I am Dave Kraft, Director of Nuclear Energy Information Service. And for those who do, I still am. We started NEIS in 1981, so we've been around the block on nuclear issues for quite a long time. And before I go on, I want to introduce two people to you who came with me tonight. We have Gail Snyder, who's our board president, and Stephanie Belenko, who just left the board recently, but we still like her, so she's still with us. And I want to thank you for having us out tonight. This is the first face-to-face presentation we've given since March of 2020. We all know why. So this is kind of exciting on the one hand, and I'm a little rusty on the other hand. In fact, I'm so rusty, I thought tonight was going to begin at 7 o'clock, which could have been something of a disaster, but I got bailed out by Gail and Stephanie. So, a little background about the group, then we'll dive into the issues. Most importantly, though, I want to spend time for you to get your questions answered. So if you have thoughts or things you want to bring up, that's more important to me than me yakking. And I say that too because part of what you're going to see tonight, we're going to put up on YouTube anyway, and we've got links that you can have, which I'll tell you how to get those later. But we started the group in 1981, back when Commonwealth Edison was running the show. They had coal plants and nuke plants. And our goal really was to translate a complicated, arcane, scientific issue into language that Joe and Josephine Couch Potato would understand. Because, you know, back in the 70s, even before the 70s, people were gee-whizzing all over the place about nuclear power. And the luster kind of wore off around 1979, I think. Many of you might recognize that year as the year that 3 Mile Island occurred. And we've had a few disasters since then as well. So our job really was to provide the information that the utilities weren't providing, that the government wasn't providing, that we were accumulating abroad because there's a nuclear industry internationally. And it's just like with any complex system, I think you can understand that everything isn't glossy, wonderful, promotional advertising brochures. Any University of Chicago graduates here? No? Okay. I like to refer to nuclear power the way they talk about it, the way Exelon and now Constellation talks about it as nuclear power in the Platonic form. And if you're familiar with Plato's philosophy, anything Platonic is sort of like the ultimate abstract perfection of something. And that's how they always talk about it. You know, we don't hear about things like rate hikes and leaks and cancer rates when you talk to nuclear executives or you hear the nuclear hucksters in the news all the time. And our job is to kind of balance that out. Now, the one thing that sets us apart from them, I think, is we are willing to admit we're wrong if shown. They're not. And as I say, we're here to kind of balance the conversation more than anything else. The trouble is it's been really tough to do in Illinois because Illinois is the birthplace of the nuclear age. 1942, December 3rd, underneath the University of Chicago squashed the United's first chain reaction here. After World War II, the University of Chicago partnered with the very new Argonne National Laboratory, which was, the original was not far away, but certainly the one you have now was an afterthought that came later. So this is really nuke central, and now we'll get into the presentation to help illustrate that a little bit. The issues that pushed this presentation actually began last year when the state was debating its energy policy through a piece of legislation called CEJA. I call it the Clean Energy Jobs Act, but that's incorrect. I forget what it stands for. Oh, Climate
and Equity Jobs Act.
Jobs Act, yes. And we were actually working with environmental groups throughout that process, especially on issues like just transitions, where we worked with many of the organizations that were fighting for that for years. In fact, we started fighting for it back in 2013, before it was even in FEJA, and it never made it in FEJA. That was the previous legislation. So what we noticed over those two pieces of legislation is that there were many significant nuclear issues that just didn't even get discussed. They weren't brought up as important. They were afterthoughts, considerations that will be dealt with by somebody else. And I think more significantly, up until the last few years, it was all controlled by Michael Madigan. And let's face it, nothing moved without that man's permission, and certainly none of the issues that we were concerned about moved without Madigan saying so, and he didn't say so. So with him being out and a new cast of characters coming in Springfield, we wanted to make them aware of all that had been not attended to for the last, 9 years of Illinois energy legislation. So we put a presentation together, which we did online in December, and we provided the legislators with a 6-page table of issues, which outlined what the issues were, what the problems and significance were for Illinois, and what our recommendations were. So that's how this presentation really got rolling. We did it online in December, and we had 5 attendees from the state staff and legislators. Our email list is 90 for the state legislators. Again, showing you the level of attention that is paid in nuclear Illinois here. So our game plan then was we were going to bring this back up, get people ready for the spring session, and then the world suddenly got turned on its head once again, in several times. We were just coming out of COVID back then, and then as you all know, we came into a new issue, the Don't Look Up moment, which lasted for all of about 5 or 6 weeks. Those of you who have Netflix, you might know what this is about, and those of you who don't, we'll get to it in a minute. But that lasted a little while, and then the Russians had the audacity to reclaim their homeland in Ukraine. So that has really been the center of attention for the rest of the time. So the world is qualitatively different than even what we were talking about in December, and it's only complicated the issues. So I'm going to touch on a few of them tonight. This PowerPoint that I'm only going to use a few slides from, we had to chunk it into 4 sessions of an hour each on 4 main topics. I'm only going to cover 2 of them very briefly tonight. But again, the presentations we gave, we have links that we would be happy to make available to you if you want to see the presentations, get into the details. So, just to back up, in case you didn't know, fill you in. We are nuclear heartland, not just because the atomic age began here, but because up until recently we had as many as 14 reactors in Illinois. Up until recently, well, fairly recently, 3 of them are no longer operating. 1 at the Dresden station down near Morris, and the 2 north of Chicago on the lakefront at Zion have been totally torn down and carted off. They're no longer in existence. So we only have 11 reactors, which only puts us in the 11th place in the world as far as nuclear power goes. And we're just behind Ukraine, which nobody wants to be behind these days, but here we are. They have 15. But we had 14 at one point, so you're catching up. So not only do we have the reactors, but you have to consider that all the waste that has ever been produced at all these reactors since the late 1960s is here, because the federal government failed in its promise to find a waste dump for it. So we have 11,000 tons of high-level radioactive waste with no place to go, in addition to low-level waste, which I won't even get into. As I mentioned here, we have 2 reactors decommissioned already and 11,000 tons, but on this map, you'll see these kind of scrawny lines emanating out from a dot in the northeastern part of the state. That dot is O'Hare Field. And what we did is we calculated out the normal-looking flight time from O'Hare Field to any of the reactors here, because those of you who are familiar with history know that the President's Commission on 9/11 documented that the terrorists had considered using a nuclear reactor as a target. Up until recently, Zion would have been the closest target, 7 minutes away from O'Hare. So we thought the public should know that there may be a safety significance in Illinois. We may not have the Russian army coming in causing trouble. We won't have tsunamis like they had in Japan, but we've got O'Hare Field. That could be problematic. So, who does not know what Don't Look Up is about? Be honest. Okay. Netflix did this showing of an amazing movie, which was nominated for Academy Award. It was a sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing to get across the idea of just how insanely stupid humanity is in confronting the climate crisis. And instead of actually using the climate as the topic, they had a bunch of astronomers discover that there was this comet coming towards Earth, and Earth only had 6 months to live because this comet was a biggie. It was a slate wiper. It was, 65 million years ago, all over again. And the effort that these scientists were trying to get the government to take some sort of realistic action. And the movie goes on and on. I won't spoil it. You should go see it. It's really killer. It's really killer. But the point of it is, in the movie, the government is persuading people not to listen to the scientists. They're telling them, don't look up. There's nothing up there you should be worried about. We got it under control. Everything's fine. So in many respects, we feel that for decades, nuclear power is the don't look up issue of Illinois. Don't look at those accidents at Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island and Windscale and Sunistan and Hosanna, and the list goes on, many of which you have not heard of before. Don't even think about the fact that in the last 6 years we bailed out Exelon reactors to the tune of $3.05 billion repair money. Not that they're all going to use it, but that's what the loan guarantees were in the CEJA legislation and the FEJA legislation combined together. Don't look at that. Forget it. Don't look at the fact that we revealed this last September, and again, nobody responded to it, that in Grundy County, one of our statisticians who does this as a living noticed that using our IDPH record database, the cancer rate in Grundy County was 20% higher than the rest of the state. And up until about a year ago, it was the worst county in the state, and now it's slipped back down to number 8, I think. We sent this report to the governor's office, both offices, Springfield and Chicago. We sent it to the IDPH office, the Illinois Department of Public Health office, Springfield and Chicago. And we never even got a response back. I did find an unfortunate secretary down in Springfield who had the misfortune of finding the envelope in an inbox down there, but I never heard from her again. So I know they received it. So again, don't look up. Don't consider that stuff. What's important is low carbon, clean green nuclear. This is what you hear in all the press and stuff. So this is why we frame it this way, that it's an issue that the powers that be really don't want you to pay attention to. So I'm going to get into just 2 of the sections very briefly, and then we're going to go for a question and answer. So the first session that we did with the legislators dealt specifically with reactor issues, because a number of things happened in the last year that have just totally rewritten the books on how nuclear power is operated in Illinois. Not just the bailouts, which I've already talked about, which was in the works, and even that's kind of a awkwardly funny story. The governor, in his wisdom, and I give him credit for this, hired an independent auditor, very high caliber, very professional, well-respected nationwide, an auditor to look at Exelon's books about whether or not they needed the bailouts. And they came back and reported to the governor, well, it's not as bad as they say it is, but over 5 years, you could give them $350 million if they need it. And if they need it means if the price of energy stays low and they're not making a profit, that would be the only way to keep them operating. So, of course, the governor gave them $694 million instead. Illinois, right? So the bailouts are one thing, and we fought this tooth and nail, and I guess we fought it so vocally and to a point where we created tensions within the environmental community where we just realized we couldn't continue working within the environmental groups. It was called the Illinois Clean Jobs. I forgot the acronym now. Help me out. Anyway, coalition. Well, coalition, yeah. And we were part of that up until like around September when the tensions were just too high. We were not getting information back from people we were asking for. We were raising questions that people did not want answered because it was upsetting the negotiation, which we had actually petitioned to be a part of a year earlier, and again, nobody got back to us on. So, this is again the treatment that they get. So we made the decision to leave the climate table partly to reduce their stress, but also to reduce ours and free us up to get these messages out unencumbered. But the second thing that changed in the last year is that Exelon doesn't own the reactors anymore. They created a spin-off company called Constellation, which happens to be an LLC. Are there any lawyers in the audience? Anyone familiar with
liability? Yeah.
Limited liability corporation. Can you tell us what that means, sort of, in layperson's terms? LLC?
Well, limited liability, just what it says, I believe. Limited liability is, I'm not a lawyer,
Okay.
but limited liability is, if you go after them or whatever, they're only limited by a certain amount of money that they would have to pay.
Yeah. Essentially, what Exelon did is because all of their reactors they claimed in Illinois were losing money, it was really dragging down their stock price. So Wall Street was getting on their case about breaking off your nuclear industry folks from the rest of the company, which was Commonwealth Edison and the other companies back east, to salvage the stock value. So by creating an LLC, there is now a legal barrier between the money-losing reactors on the one hand, and they have 20, I want to say 22 or 23 around the country. We have our 11 in Illinois, but they have the reactors back east which have the same problems of losing money. And the point is, if those reactors now have any serious accidents, need to have expensive repairs, like they have hugely expensive machinery in these reactors. Steam generators are $250,000 a piece. And there are 4 of them at Braidwood and 4 of them at Byron. If they need money for that, there's only 2 places you can get it. The ratepayers and the ratepayers. Because you can no longer go back to the parent company, Exelon, and say, help us out, we need repairs here. So it was a very ingenious situation. We don't know how it's going to play out, but we suggested to our colleagues, don't you think you ought to study this and see what the implications long-term will be of creating Constellation? So that was an issue we brought up. And then finally, our so-called nuclear regulators. At the federal level, it's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. And we have been dealing with the NRC for all 41 of our years, and came to the conclusion I'd say about 28, 22 years ago, that NRC stands for not really concerned. Because they have become a rubber stamp for the industry that they're supposed to regulate. Now, I'm not saying that the inspectors at the reactors and the workers in the field are not doing their jobs. They are. They are very competent, trained, qualified people. But there's a layer in there, a line in there that when you cross, you go from rationality and science and engineering, and you take the deep dive into the pig's pit of politics. And that's where the problem comes in. And that's where the NRC rolls. Okay? So we pointed out that earlier this year, the NRC was starting to grant 80-year reactor operating licenses. Now, why is that significant? Well, 2 reasons. How many of you came here in your 1948 Chevy tonight? How many of you have flown to Europe in a DC-3? Oh, you did. Is that military?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. The point is, that's a long time, even when you keep the machinery working well. But originally, the reactors were licensed for 40 years. It was then, probably about 20 or so years ago, where the utilities petitioned the NRC saying, look, we think we can keep these babies running a little longer. Give us another 20 years. So all of the reactors in Illinois, except for Clinton, got a 20-year extension to operate up to 60 years from their original start date. Now the NRC and some of the utilities are saying, well, we were just kidding. Not 60 years, 80 years. And believe it or not, last year there was even some talk about a 100-year operating license for nuclear power plants. Now, link that thought up to the thought that currently Exelon has 10 or 11 reactors that are money losers and require being bailed out every 5 years. And now you want to run that game for 100 years? We got a problem. So we thought, let's talk. Can we talk? Isn't that what's her name used to say? I forget who it was, but So this is what we're trying to get across to legislators and get a dialogue on. And this was the meat of the first section on reactor issues. And we recommended that just do something simple. Set up a task force. examine it, study it, bring in independent experts. Now that we got rid of Michael Madigan, for Christ's sake. Anyway, but to examine the issues of how old are these reactors, which ones really do need serious repairs. In fact, one of my other board members and I attended the relicensing of the Byron and the Braidwood reactors in 2013. And in their filing documents, they were even suggesting, Exelon was suggesting, they may need to replace the steam generators in the future. So they had in their own documentation that this could be an expensive repair to anticipate for the future. Let's find out. See how extensive that is. So, let's see, move this kind of quick along. We already talked about the audits and the fact that an audit was done and the governor gave them twice as much as what the audit suggested. But the other thing about bailouts is it becomes habit forming. You know, it's sort of like Coke for utilities. And it turns out, I'm not just saying this metaphorically, but it perpetuates the cycle that we had before, which we've labeled the nuclear hostage crisis. And what that is like what happened with CEJA and what happened with FEJA prior to that. Exelon, back then, and now Constellation in the future will announce, these plants are not making us money. If you really want to hit your climate targets of no carbon releases and keep them open, we're going to need X number of $1 million more. Or we're going to close the reactors on such and such a date. Well, what that does is it certainly works up the workers who work at those plants. And these reactors have 800 to 900 personnel, some of them, at the plant, as opposed to a coal-fired plant or a gas-fired plant, which have maybe 50 to 150. So this is a big employer. It's a company-town situation. So of course, the entire tax base of the town is tied to the reactor. So when they announce they're closing, what's going to happen? Well, we need no more than point to Zion, Illinois on that map that I have up there. In the late 1990s, ComEd pulled the plug on them, and they lost 55% of their tax base in one day. So you can imagine what that did to public services, school districts, hospitals, police, fire. Totally trashed their real estate market. You know, all the workers moved out. It was a disaster. They had nothing in place. So we were suggesting the way to fight the nuclear hostage crisis, because those communities and workers are held hostage, because their job now is to go with torches and pitchforks to their state legislators and say, bail us out. We need these jobs. You know, and that's how they gamed the system. And that's what happened in 2016. That's what happened last year. That's the nuclear hostage crisis. Excuse me. A little froggy here. And it's not just a fiction, because about, how many years ago was this? 4 years ago, I think, in New York, there was a utility conference going with an Exelon legislator who was doing a slideshow, and he puts up there this slide. His name is Michael Krancer, and we'll be glad to give you send a copy of this. Finally, Steve Daniels at Crane's Business got wind of this. And here's the slide that the Exelon guy put up for all of utility people saying, look, bailouts are profitable. They should be part of the business model, because in New York, we invested only, what was it, $500 million, but we got $5.7 billion back in bailouts. A 750% ROI. It's part of their business model. And again, we tried to let legislators in on the game. We're hoping they'll catch on. So this is why we're opposed to bailouts. It's because it is no longer even rationally sound that it's going to do the job it's supposed to do. It's really there to keep the reactors going, keep the nuclear hostage crisis going, and keep a money flow going into now Constellation. So, Constellation made it clear that first of all, they're going to seek the 80-year operating license. They're no dummies. They can see a cash cow when it's in front of them. But they also make it clear that they'll only keep the reactors open if it's economically viable to do so, or if there are policy considerations. And that's English, Steve Daniels translates that into English as bailouts, either at the federal level or at the state level. So, those are the implications of keeping these things going. Not to mention the fact that if you keep them going for 80 years, you will add another 10,000 tons of high-level radioactive waste generated to Illinois. It's already 11,000 tons with no place to go.
Where do you start?
On the site They have either a glorified swimming pool, which they have to keep the waste in immediately when they take it out, but for about 5 years, maybe sometimes 10. Sits there to cool down, and then they move it to these outdoor cylinders, they're canisters, and you might see some, if you ever go up to Dresden, or up to Zion, you can see them clearly. But at
They took
Dresden,
them down in Zion.
what?
They took the cylinders down.
They took the big reactor buildings
Yeah.
down. They replaced those with the storage facilities for the radioactive waste. There's 63 of these smaller cylinders that are on a big pad. We call it the nuclear bowling alley because it looks like, they've got pins set up for somebody that's. So, the other thing about an 8-year operating license, I was joking to you about flying and driving a little while ago, but this is something that engineers are familiar with called the Bathtub Curve. And it uniquely applies to nuclear power plants that at the beginning of a reactor's operation, you could expect problems. There are going to be startup glitches. As, people haven't worked together, they don't know the machines well, maybe there was a part that was installed wrong. You can expect problems at the beginning. So the curve goes down on the left there. Then the thing is operating for a while, they figure out all the bugs, the next 10, 20 years, cross your fingers, everything's going well, but then parts start to wear out. Things get old. They can't find the parts. And then you start seeing on the right-hand side of the screen that you're going to have more downtime, more significant issues happening at the reactors. This applies to your car. It applies to your dishwasher. It's just an engineering phenomenon. But the difference is if your dishwasher goes down, you're not going to take out the community. If theirs goes down, we got a problem. So aging reactors mean increased cost. You're going to be replacing parts, like I say. Some of them will be expensive. And this was the icing on the cake. We didn't know this last December when we talked to legislators. But let's see, is this the one? No. Oops. Maybe I went too fast, yeah. Well, I'll tell you about this since I can't find the slide. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission announced in late February its Office of Inspector General had determined that at any number of nuclear power plants around the country, there were fraudulent, substandard, and counterfeit parts being used. How they determined that is in the report. It's 300 pages long. But they don't know exactly which parts and which plants. So, throw the dartboard at that map I had up there earlier. And they're going to operate these things for 80 years. And again, if they have to replace the parts, it'll be costly. If they don't replace the parts, it could be costly. So it's a no-win situation, but the NRC released that information. And specifically, they did a different report about Dresden, which said last year, their operating performance there, the things weren't working very well. It's still within their safety parameters, but they had noticed a decline in performance, mechanical performance of the Dresden nuclear power station, the second oldest power station in the country. As I mentioned, more radioactive waste. So again, we tried to get this across to legislators. It's inescapable. And as I said, roughly 10,000 more tons would be added if they get their 80-year operating license. And let's see. Now, we want to make sure that we bring this up at every opportunity, that the nuclear industry is corrupt. It's not just Illinois. Because at the time when we were all getting all worked up about Michael Madigan being indicted in the FBI and all those other ComEd people being under indictment and their trials begin this September, it was happening elsewhere. The Speaker of the House of Ohio lost his job and was indicted by the FBI, as well as 3 other legislators there, in a $65 million bribery case to keep their reactor operating there and to juice the legislature to grant bailouts. And if that wasn't bad enough, in South Carolina, they had been building a nuclear plant there for a decade. $9 billion had been spent. And one of the executives at the utility there called SCANA fessed up and said, we fudged the data. It was a fraud. We plead guilty. So $9 billion down the toilet. The reactor will never get completed. That's South Carolina. Now, another example of legalized extortion is taking place down at the Vogtville plant, 3 and 4, down in Georgia. This is a reactor, the only reactors in this country that are being constructed at this point. No other new ones are being constructed. It's 6 years late. It hasn't even started up yet. They don't expect it to start up for another year or two. And it ballooned out from $14 billion for 2 reactors to a current estimate of $31 billion for 2 reactors. And the ratepayers are in line to shoulder the burden for a lot of it, even if the reactors don't get finished and they never produce any power. So we're talking about an incredible Ponzi scheme going here with the nuclear industry. And my question to legislators was very simple. Is the age of Madigan over? Is the reign of error finished finally? Or are we just introducing a new one where you guys get to pull the strings and the levers? And we've got to be, and we're going to keep hammering this on. We don't go down there to make friends, but we need a little help to raise the ante. So that ended our first presentation on the reactor issues in Illinois. I'm going to skip this next session, which was about what happens when you tear down a reactor. It's going to take a minute to do a little fast forward here. Oh, let me just show you that. This is the Zion site today. Those are the high-level radioactive waste canisters called dry casks, which are about, if you go 400 yards to the right, you can swim. That's like Michigan. And you can see these from the road, and we're saying it's not a particularly safe way to store waste. I mean, if anyone can see it from the road, maybe they can bring drones in. Maybe they could use these shoulder-held weapons that we're worried about, which we told them about in our other presentations. This is how they're doing it now, and we don't want it that way.
Will
So-
that affect the groundwater?
If nothing goes wrong, no.
Oh.
But if something goes wrong, yeah, it could. So this is the next one I wanted to get to, because one of the issues that came up when CJA was being debated and voted on was the environmental community really did not have a sense or a feel that if you shut down the fossil fuel plants, which would be coal and natural gas, that you could also shut down the new plants and have electricity to keep the state operating. They weren't convinced that that could be done in the time period. So they felt that for now, you had to bite the bullet, keep the new plants going so that we could close the coal and the gas plants. I fully understand that point of view, but we have met experts who contest that point of view. And we don't feel that enough dialogue took place to really make a determination whether that was true or not. And we were coming from the standpoint of, rather than speculate, can Illinois keep the lights on if we shut everything down, or by when would that happen? Let's find out. I mean, what a concept, you know? Do the homework. And that's all we were saying. It's like, let's get their experts and our experts in the same room, you know, pad the walls, soft gloves, and duke it out. Bring your charts, bring your databases, explain why you think you can't, or why you think you can. That's a very important question to ask, so that we can get off of that nuclear hostage crisis. And no better put than by my favorite American author. So we were trying to tell them that there's precedent for doing this sort of thing. In fact, Michael Madigan himself did it back in 2014, 15. He rigged a study called HR 1146, which the marching orders for it were given to 4 state agencies to determine what would the impacts be on Illinois if we closed down the reactors. You know, what would the negative effects be on Illinois without nuclear power? Now, it's a semi-reasonable question, but it's only reasonable if you ask the other half of it. What are the downsides of keeping them open? Is there another way of doing it? We actually tried to schedule appointments with each of the 4 agencies. One agency declined for very professional reasons, and we accepted it. We did have interviews with the other 3. And we were told that they were not allowed to investigate that question. That they were given marching orders to only look at this and not squish beyond and examine these other questions which we raised in 7 pages. With the exception of one agency, we could tell that they did the best they could to take the party balloon dogs and twist it into a report which included some of our materials, but it was disguised. But the other two, they went along with the Mike Madigan approach. Well, we want something a little more robust, I think is the term that's being used these days. So we're recommending, let's take a year and find out. Let's bring your experts in, let's bring our experts in, let's figure it out. We are of the opinion, and we have put some presentations together which are on YouTube, or will shortly be on YouTube, which say it can be done. And here's one of the guys who says so. Professor Mark Jacobson of Stanford University wrote this book. He's revised it twice now. This is the most current version of last year, where he did a state-by-state analysis, which indicated how those states could get to 100% renewable energy. And that's the important question. How do you do it? It may well be we can get there, but it could be extremely expensive, but we don't know. Or it could not be expensive. We don't know. But the fact of how you get there and determining that is critical. And Mark's already done some of the homework. So we say, come on in, Constellation. Poke holes in his study. Let's find out. But he isn't the only guy who did this. Here's an example. This is the old, I took this from his older report of 2016, but he breaks it out, how Illinois can go to 100% renewables. And you won't find any fossil fuels up there, and you won't find any nuclear plants up there. But another friend and colleague of ours has been doing this for longer than I've been doing this, is Dr. Arjun Makijani, president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research in Tacoma Park, Maryland. In 2007, we took up the bandwagon with him for his book, Carbon-Free, Nuclear-Free, a roadmap for American energy policy. And it was a book that was written on a challenge. Some of you may know the name of Dr. Helen Caldicott. Maybe yes, maybe no. Pediatrician from Australia, but very staunchly anti-nuclear. And she said to Arjun one day, she said, Arjun, can we get off of all fossil fuels and nuclear? And by when? He said, no, it can't be done. Can't be done. All right, how about if I give you a year and financial backing to research it? Will you do it? He said, all right, I'll do it. So it took him a year, and carbon-free, nuclear-free is the result of his study. However, he was wrong, because the study initially was, can we do it by the year 2050? And he found out that using off-the-shelf 2007 technology, we could cost-effectively do it by 2040. So we were trying to get the environmental community here interested in this as well, but have no takers again. So subsequently, he's in Maryland. The report on the left-hand side of this screen here is a report he did for the state of Maryland, which is exactly what we are asking be done in Illinois. Can Maryland get to 100% renewable, and how do you do it? He wrote the book. So it's out there. Poke holes in it. Be my guest. Be his guest. But let's find out. And one of the things we've been trying to get across to legislators since 2013 is you can't build an energy future by bailing out the past. It just doesn't work. I remember jokingly saying at one of the testimonies we gave for FIJA back in 2016, will we be having hearings soon to bail out the blacksmiths or the clipper ship sales manufacturers? Why not? It's a technology that served us to a point, and its time is over. And we'll get into some of the final reasons for that, and then we'll break this open for question and answer. Here's another guy who seems to think nuclear is really off base, especially as a climate solution. I put this slide up as an example of what a good presenter would never do in a PowerPoint presentation, because you can't possibly read that stuff. But essentially, Amory has been at this, again, longer than I have, and he co-founded the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado. He is now a professor at Stanford University in California, and most recently has published some absolutely blistering and detailed critiques of why nuclear power is not a climate solution. And it's very simple. It's arithmetic. You crunch the numbers on the economics, and it just doesn't work for nuclear. It's working for renewables, in terms of growth, in terms of what you can do, but also we have to become more energy efficient. He's very firm with that, and we've been firm with that as long as we've been in existence too. So he's another resource that could be brought in to discuss this. In 1999, the organization started a program called You Can't Nuke Global Warming. Well, times have changed, and we changed the name of the program to We Can't Nuke Climate Change, because global warming is passe. So. But anyway, we concocted a kind of a meme to get across to people how you should approach the climate crisis. I mean, the best person in the world right now to talk about a climate crisis is Gretchen. Absolutely. I mean, she says, we adults have to treat a crisis like a crisis, and you're not doing it. You leave it to us kids to have to do it for you. I mean, how stupid is that? So she has ripped the emperor's clothes off numerous times in the last 3 or 4 years. But prior to her coming on scene, we also had a way of approaching the climate crisis, and we created what we call the 2x4 rule. Because we realized with all the climate deniers out there, sometimes the only way to get through them is just to take a 2x4. And so we came up with our own little 2x4 based on 2 constraints and 4 rules. And these are the constraints. And they're not just any old kind of constraints. They are survival constraints. Again, don't look up. Don't look up. The first one is time. Just earlier this year, again, the IPCC said 2030. Clock's ticking, you know, stands a timer coming out of the dollar. Time is finite. We're running out of it, and we aren't doing jack. In fact, the CO2 levels are rising. Coal production and use is rising at a time when we have to not just come up with new energy solutions, but have them in place and rewriting the entire economy in 7 years and 7 months, 8 months time. Time. Second constraint is obviously money, unless you're Constellation or Mike Madigan, Governor Pritzker. There is a third consideration, which I think has really reared its ugly head recently, and that is security. And we'll get to that kind of as we wrap up here today, that nuclear power in this world is really not a good idea at this point. But what are the rules? Very simple. One long run-on sentence. The only basis on which you can select an effective climate-fighting energy resource is that the resource takes the most carbon out of the atmosphere in the quickest time possible, at the lowest possible cost, and here's the one everybody forgets, without creating an equally planet-threatening issue. Like, let's say, nuclear war. You know, we think they're kind of on par. Even the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist says that, you know, climate change and nuclear extinction are co-equal at this point. So these are our 4 rules and our 2 constraints. And over the years, we pointed out, nuclear power doesn't meet any of these. All they do is reinforce what we have and pad the pockets, if not of the existing folks at Constellation and Exelon and Duke Power and all the others who run it, but the new money-grubbing entrepreneurs, you know, the Elon Musks, you know the list. They're in it for the DOE contracts, folks. If they happen to come up with a reactor, new one that works, that's great. But for 20 years of DOE contracts, they're on board. Who says so? The former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission says so, not me. In fact, 2 former chairs. The person who came after him came to the same conclusion. Nuclear is not a climate solution. This guy's got a PhD in physics. He was the NRC chair for 7 years, I believe, and he was forced out because he was the only NRC commissioner who was fighting strongly for safety enhancements after Fukushima. Here's another former NRC commissioner, and I really like his quote, so I'm going to read it to you because it's quaint. It's 12 years old, but when I first heard it, I thought, I got to meet this guy. This is Peter Bradford, former NRC, not chairman, but he was a commissioner, but he later became the Public Services Chair for the states of New York, and then later the state of Maine. So I think the guy knows energy, he knows utilities, and he knows the NRC. And he really fights very strongly against this notion that y'all probably hear about. We got to do it all. We have to consider everything. Everything's on the table, right? Which is a pile of baloney to begin with. But he expresses it so well here. He says, the urgency of world hunger doesn't compel us to fight it with caviar. no matter how nourishing fish eggs might be. Spending large sums on elegant solutions, especially those with side effects, that provide little relief will diminish what we can spend on more promising approaches. We can't do everything. In fact, I have a different slide in a different slideshow that proves it. Because I just wait for those folks to say, we have to do it all. Everything's under consideration. And I say, wow, does that include predatory capitalism? Oh, I thought so. No, not everything is on the table. All right. And then, of course, you're probably hearing now that the next wonder invention are the small modular reactors. And again, they have their own set of problems, not the least of which is this is the new sucking noise that you hear coming out of entrepreneurial kingdoms. You know, DOE contracts. The well, they're the same. Biden administration just gave them $3 billion of that infrastructure plan for development of new nuclear reactors, which aren't going to be available until the year 2030, even as demonstrators. What's the cutoff date for the IPCC said? 2030. Oops, somebody goofed. Arithmetic. And again, the two former chairs of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said, you guys are full of it. You know, these things are not going to fly. They won't be economically viable. They're going to take money away from what we can do. Forget it. Ain't going to work. So earlier this year, former Chairman Yatsko also teamed up with equally prestigious professionals in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom who came to the same conclusion, that new reactors are a boondoggle. You're going to do it. The state held 2 meetings about this already, however. They did one last year. The state senate did. It was a 2.5-hour dog and pony show of academics, entrepreneurs, marketers, and utility people. Not a single opponent or critical voice was allowed to testify at that hearing. That was last year. This year, we kind of muzzled our way into a House Energy and Environment Committee meeting, and our board president, Gail, testified there, not knowing that the proponents of small modular reactors, one of whom was a state legislator, brought 4 other witnesses. So they got almost a half an hour of time. Gail got 9 minutes to present the con position. So again, we had some recommendations on this. Let's not go there. All right, so again, we're suggesting find out. Set up state task forces. So let's see. I have one last slide here I'll show you, and then we'll get into the Q&A. I already talked to you about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I will point out we do have state inspectors at each nuclear power plant as well. This is from the Illinois Department of Nuclear Safety. And again, these are qualified people. They're trained, they're scientists, they're engineers. The problem is at the state level, they do not have any authority to enact safety measures, to order anything to be done to the plant. That is totally under the control of the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So these folks are on that site as observers to report back to the governor, to the state legislature, and to make suggestions, essentially. So they're good people, but again, this used to be a cabinet level position in state government, and now they are a subset of IEMA. So you can imagine what their budget looks like. So, back to where we're at. Don't look up. And I guess the final piece, I did put a slide in here about it, but we can talk a minute about it, is what have we learned about nuclear power from Ukraine? And I'm sure you've been following the news. I know we've been following it, Gail especially, very carefully since everything emerged. Everything from the Russians taking over the Chernobyl site and making it a fiasco, to the point where we don't know how many, but we do know that a lot of their soldiers who were stationed there went away with severe acute radiation poisoning because they were tromping around radioactive woods with no protective gear. When they left the place, they looted it. They took radioactive materials as well as equipment. They weren't allowing new workers in. There was no way to get emergency diesel generator fuel there to keep the power running. This is nuclear power in a war zone. It's something we've never had to encounter before. But in the world that we look at ahead, where our nuclear marketers want to send nuclear power plants to, I just saw that Uganda is putting their hat in the ring for a nuclear power plant. Anybody ever remember Idi Amin? You know, Saudi Arabia and the UAE wants a nuclear power plant. What the hell, did the sun stop shining over there? You know, I mean, come on. What do they want it for? What's it for?
They're listening.
It's for nuclear weapons. It's about nuclear proliferation. Let's stop the bullshit.
Yep.
But don't look up. Don't challenge the State Department. Let Westinghouse sell their stuff abroad. And here's the macabre, what will be the adjective? The macabrest, funny of the whole situation. The Biden administration wants all this money for the new reactors, which won't be available in time to help us out. The kicker is that most of the designs they're looking at run on a very specialized kind of fuel, not the kind we put in our reactors now, but a special fuel called HALEU. It's not a joke, HALEU. It's high-assay, low-enriched uranium. The only place you can get it in the world today is Russia. Oh no.
Oh my God.
And we put an oil embargo on Russia, didn't we? We're not going to have any of that Russian oil come over here and contaminate our cars and our air. But we didn't put the embargo on uranium. 40% of the uranium in the operating reactors today comes from Russia and the Central Asian republics. So all of this crap that you hear from the politicians, from the Department of Energy, running around the country with their dog and pony shows about we need new reactors for climate crisis. It's nonsense. The fix is in. It's crony capitalism. And now we're introducing it into a war zone. And look who wants nuclear power. North and South Korea. Taiwan and China. India and Pakistan. Is there a theme that runs through those by any chance? Just the other day, the government of South Korea has made it pretty clear that they are going to begin looking into manufacturing their own nuclear weapons. And a few years ago, some of you might remember that one of the more conservative members in Japan, who was running for a seat, in a very Japanese way said to the Chinese, and don't forget, we have about 1,000 bombs worth of plutonium in storage here if we ever needed it. This is the world as it is. It is not the platonic form. And there's no place in it for nuclear power. So this is what we try to get across to the legislators. And we cut them a lot of slack. And I have to say, their staffers are really, the ones who show up are amazing. They really want to know this stuff. And, you know, gold stars across the board for these folks. But they can only do so much. The rest has to come from us. I mean, we have to just say, you know, emperor's naked, folks. We'll get to 100% renewables, but we're not going to make Illinois the Belarus of the Midwest to get there. So, thank you for listening to me. Don't believe a word I said. Go back and check my sources first, and then you can applaud. But I think that the rest of the time we'll have available, we'll, you know, have some dialogue, some question and answer. And Gail, did you want to say
I
something?
just wanted to address two things that you said. The first one was at the subject matter hearing that I attended for the representatives of the state.
Sarah.
The purpose of it was the purpose of it was to address what they wanted to do, and what they wanted to, or what was being presented there, was to stop our moratorium. So Illinois has a moratorium on building any new nuclear reactors until there's a resolution as to what to do with the nuclear waste. And so this legislator wanted to lift the moratorium. Well, why did he want to lift the moratorium? Well, he had all these people lined up to speak about the great new industry of small modular nuclear reactors. And so really it's an entrepreneurial business venture that a lot of people are on that side are really excited about starting here in Illinois, and they want to start this up, and this is why they want to lift the moratorium. So when I went to speak, only one person on that side of the issue even mentioned the waste. And the whole point of the conversation was about lifting moratorium, which is about the waste. Nobody talked about the waste. It was amazing. And I ended up in a debate, really, on small modular reactor. They were forced modular reactors. I wasn't prepared to debate that. I was coming about the other issue. So this is what we're up against, is an industry that is, and a bunch of entrepreneurs who are looking to advance that industry. The other thing I wanted to say was about the safety issue. So in Ukraine, they were firing missiles over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which has 6 reactors. It's the largest reactor facility complex in Europe. And so extremely dangerous. They could have had another Chernobyl there. And the other thing that I learned recently is, they were thinking like, why did the Russians come in and take Chernobyl? What's the point, right? It doesn't have an operating reactor there. It has the nuclear waste. It has a sarcophagus over the blown up, melted down reactor. What was the purpose? And the purpose was a general wanted to make his base there because he knew the Ukrainians wouldn't attack it. And that is a lot of what happened down in Zaporozhye, was they made their efforts and coalesced around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant because they knew they wouldn't get attacked. So this is what we see for the future of reactors in a nuclear war zone, as they will be used as a shield to protect whoever is there from getting attacked, because who's going to attack the nuclear power plant, right? So I just wanted to add those 2 points.
Well, it's funny you asked that question, Gail, because I can answer it. Who would want to attack a nuclear power plant?
Russia.
Israel, the United States, NATO, because they've already done it. I have a different slideshow. I think I brought it with me, but it's the connection between weapons and power. And if you go back, to the 1980s, there's a whole list of bombed reactors. Now, mercifully, most of the time, they were in the process of being built. They didn't have the fuel in, they weren't operating. But there were a couple of episodes which it's really iffy whether there were nuclear materials there or not. That was particularly the case in Yugoslavia during the war in the Balkans. And during the Iran-Iraq war, where those idiots, they didn't give a crap who they were hurting. They were lobbing stuff at each other, and we all know that up to a point, Iraq was looking into nuclear, and up to a point, Iran was doing the same. But they had nuclear materials, they just didn't have the reactors. And they didn't have it in Iraq because Israel bombed the site at Osirik, which is outside of Baghdad. So, who would want to bomb a reactor, Gail? You'd be surprised. All right, thank you. Gail, how do you want to handle this, Ellen? Are you the MC, or do we just flail away here for a while?
Somebody else,
Question? All right, we have one here, and then okay. You were first.
Okay, well, I should probably be embarrassed to ask this, but that's not going to stop me. Could you explain what the small modular nuclear reactors are and what they would be used for?
Yes, that's a very good question. It's really fundamental. The reactors in play in the world today are about 1,000 megawatts, or 1 gigawatt of power. They are beasts, they are huge. And they build them that big for economies of scale, essentially. But, they had their problems, and now, as we pointed out, they're not economic anymore. So the industry got this grand idea that one of the reasons was that one size fits all doesn't fit all. They realized that, the community of Vermont's energy needs are a lot different than the energy needs of the city of Chicago. They might need a Braidwood here and there, but you guys, a couple of toaster ovens, you get by or whatever. Something smaller. So the idea, theoretically, again in the Platonic form, was, if we could only make them smaller, then we could mass produce them in factories instead of building them on site, which would be a lot cheaper. We would standardize the design. They would be small. We could put them in Walmarts and Sam's Clubs and Costco's. And, this is the thinking. Smaller. The problem is that in the process of unleashing this concept, it has ballooned and morphed in strange ways. So we have a situation now, which is why Gail was testifying, for example, that the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana is investigating building what's called a micro-nuclear reactor. this is a really teeny tiny guy. I mean, I forget the exact size, but we're talking, I forget, somewhere near 20 megawatts, or it's something really ridiculously small, so that they can run research on the design and see if it could be scaled up, and then maybe they could use the waste heat to, you know, make steam for the campus. You know, silly small things. Little teeny tiny ones. But some of the bigger versions of these puppies are up to 200 megawatts apiece. So the idea is you would have a campus of 200 watters, and you'd only buy as many as you needed. You wouldn't need a 2200 megawatt Braidwood. You might only need a 700 megawatt Lamont. You know, doop, 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 doop. And because these are supposedly an inherently safe design, which would never melt down, honest, you'd only need one control room and one reactor to manage the whole show. And even better, because they won't melt down, you could reduce the emergency planning zone from the current 10 miles away from the reactors to 100 yards. So this is the thinking that is driving these new modular designs. They can produce them in factories, ship them in trucks, set them up, you know, put them underground, plug them in, go away for 20 years. Nobody will ever think to dig there.
Oh my God.
This is, you know, now I'm being flip. And there are many designs now, but remarkably, only one design has been licensed in all these years by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There have been a couple of designs which had to be withdrawn for fraud because the data they were claiming was fake. And, you know, they were on DOE grants, and you know, so that they had to admit it. And then there are others like Bill Gates, you know, with his traveling wave reactor. And, oh gosh, that man, what did he do on that island down there? But the thing about Gates is I first learned about, huh? You know what I mean? Okay. Gates, I first saw the Gates thing about, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago. He did this TED Talk, half-hour TED Talk. And you know, the first 23 minutes are just, you know, Flash Gordon, whiz bang, you know, makes its own gravy, just terrific stuff, eats its own waste, you know, over the bedding. Oh, but you know, we're to a point where we have this concept, but it's going to take about 10 to 20 years of development, and the DOE is going to have to come up with grants, and you know, that's where the action is at. So I thought Bill Gates, you're a master, you are a real master. I won't say what kind, but anyway, so this is what we're up against. You know, it's the new hucksters, the new marketeers who have a new product, nothing can go wrong, and you're supposed to swallow it. I went very fast over this, but I can certainly and happily get you easily understandable links or pieces of literature where you can find out a little bit more about that. Just put your...
I read everything over that.
Cool. All right. Just send us an email. I'll make sure you get things.
Okay.
Thank you. Do you guys know each other?
Yeah,
Everybody know everybody?
yeah.
Why don't you say who you are and ask your question just so everybody knows?
Gary.
We don't know you.
Gary.
Good.
Gary, Eddie's human.
I'm Gary.
Hi, how close are we, or somebody, to a workable commercial thorium reactor?
It's an interesting question. We have not studied the thorium reactors in detail, very broad brushstroke stuff. But from what we've heard about India and their examination of it, and what we've even seen in this country is it's not even on the radar screen yet with DOE. There's a lot of talk, but no money behind it. A lot of promises again, and again, the physics, to a certain level, makes more sense even than some of the reactors we have going today.
They actually built one in the 60s that was working.
They did have some, they had one working some time back.
The only problem is that you can't make a bomb out of the thorium. So
That's the
why
kicker,
it's-
you can. In these, all the reactors go on radioactive materials, predominantly off the uranium spectrum of isotopes. An isotope is just another name for a type of uranium. The analogy I use is, if there are any Irish people here who have big extended families, right, about 22 cousins and stuff, you're all O'Neills, right? But some of you are male, some are female, some are tall, some are short, some have long hair, some not, some are whatever. All O'Neills. Uranium's the same way. There are a whole bunch of uraniums, but only certain ones are beneficial to be used in reactors. Certain isotopes only, 235. 238 is the predominant ore, isotope you find in the ore, but 235 is the kicker. That's the real energetic uranium that gets the chain reactions moving and stuff. And the problem is that thorium itself is not a fuel, but it has to be bombarded by uranium-235, which then breaks up the thorium into a form of plutonium, which is more active. And actually the 235 is usable in certain weapons configurations. So to say that it doesn't, it isn't a participant in weapons proliferation would not be totally correct. So again, I don't know a lot of details about thorium, and I know some folks who are just absolutely gung-ho about it, but I don't know enough to really say. What I could refer you, though, to is one of the presenters we mentioned here, Dr. Arjun Makijani, who is Indian, has written a lot about the thorium reactors, and I'd be happy to get you his contact information. He could give you some info. Okay? So just sign the sheet, put a note there, and I'll make sure to get that info.
Joe, you had some questions?
Your name?
On one of your earlier slides, you had something about safety and security. So what is the cost for security of a nuclear reactor plant, say in Braidwood? And you're talking about these smaller ones that may pop up one day. Would you need security for them as well? What is the cost of something like that?
Well, you unpacked a real bundle there, let me tell you. I don't know the exact cost, first of all. And part of that would be classified now anyway. After 9/11, everything changed. I mean, it was really interesting. Just prior to 9/11, some of our colleagues at the University, the Union of Concerned Scientists, actually did a safety analysis of what was going on around the country. It was ridiculous. In fact, there was a huge Time magazine scandal that security guards at nuclear plants back then were earning less than the local McDonald's. So you can imagine the quality of personnel you're getting at that rate, first of all. A lot of them weren't trained. They do have weapons on site, but they're in locked lockers that is on the other side of the plant. Just goofy stuff. But then after 9/11, everything got hush-hush. So all the information is pulled tight. So I'm sure the security is much, much better than it was before. We know it's armed. We know it is professional. But we also know that the NRC has scaled back on what they used to call force-on-force exercises. And this was prior to 9/11. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission actually hired an ex-Navy SEAL and a team that he put together to test reactor security. And he was successful at destroying the reactor 55% of the time, prior to 9/11. So what does the NRC do in response to that? They fired him.
Got the question.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other consideration now. These reactors are losing money. So where does a corporation go first to save money? You cut personnel is one, and you cut back on operating and maintenance costs. And security is a very interesting one because it was actually one of the final nails in the coffin for the Zion station north of Chicago when we had the map up here. There were a number of bonehead things that led up to the closure of Zion, but the final one was a mutiny by the security force there because they complained. They said, we cannot do our job. We don't have what we need to defend this facility against someone who really wants to do harm here. And they got crap for it. A lot of them got fired. They went on strike. And while they were on strike, ComEd pulled the plug and shut the plant down. That was one of the reasons.
Wow.
They called it a morale issue.
Wow.
So I don't know the real answer to the question you asked. Now, what about these small modular reactors? Well, because they won't melt down ever. The attitude of the industry is you don't need that kind of security. They are self-managing. They're going to be underground. They're going to be this. They're going to be that. You don't have to worry about it melting down. So I would imagine the security would be qualitatively and quantitatively less than what we have currently at Dresden at Byron, at Braidwood, the reactors we got. So, sorry I can't give you more detail on that, but again, part of that is even just national security stuff. They wouldn't let me hear it. So. Who are you?
Sandy here. You know what, Dave, I mean, with Gail going before them with the waste, is anybody even looking at the waste that's at all these facilities and what's going to be done with the waste? Has anybody brought up or brought back the GNEP where they want to do the reprocessing and all that holy baloney, you know?
How many here remember GNEP? All right, show it now.
Oh.
Okay. See those guys after it, so it's a great story. Well, the federal government in 1982 enacted a law which said that the federal government will be responsible for the disposal of radioactive waste, take it back from the utilities, and have it disposed of beginning in 1997. And they didn't. And since then, you know, they poked around and they had Yucca Mountain in Nevada as a site that was under consideration, which turned out to be very flawed. If you listen to one of those former Nuclear Regulatory Commission chairs, who's a trained geologist, said it was flawed. And so Yucca Mountain got canceled in the Obama administration, which left the nation with absolutely no place under consideration for a permanent disposal facility. The new scam is, since we have no place to dispose of it, maybe what the nation needs is centralized storage of all the waste in a location where we'll just kind of file it away and wait for the disposal facility to get built. But it'll be away from the reactor sites. Now, there's a certain amount of logic to that. We get some of it, but when you start scratching the detail, you know, down to the detail of that concept, it's flawed. And again, the bottom line is follow the money. And one of the big companies that's involved in this scheme, and I call it a scheme, is in the process of not only they manage radioactive waste now in New Mexico, but there's another company that is doing this in West Texas. They monitor low-level waste. They want to get in the high-level waste business to store this waste centrally, to get paid by the federal government to do it. But one of the companies is now in the market for buying up these money-losing reactors to get at the decommissioning funds there. So they'll do the teardown, but they'll do it on the cheap and pocket the difference. And then they will have ownership of the waste that they can take to their facility and make more money off of. So it's this whole kind of revolving scheme with a company called Holtec to become this radioactive waste, magnet, and to make a whole lot of money off of it. So we have been opposing what are called centralized interim storage facilities that are being proposed for West Texas and Southeast New Mexico. And not just on the issues of safety, which are, those of you who did know about GNEP know that transportation was a really big issue. And those of you who are following the news know that the state of Illinois got a ranking of D by the Society of Professional Engineers, once again, for its roads and its rails. So we're going to throw 11,000 tons or 21,000 tons of radioactive waste on our highways and bridges. Aren't you guys doing a new bridge out here near Joliet or something? Why?
It's 40 years old already.
So? It's rusty. Okay, it could handle, 150-ton shipping casks, couldn't it?
Of nuclear waste.
Of nuclear waste. Anyway, so, but that's not the only reason. What we haven't heard a lot about, and this is one of the blessings of CEJA, because CEJA and its predecessor, even FEJA, helped put two things on the map, on the radar screen. One was the notion of just transitions, which means we get rid of that crappy nuclear hostage crisis, solar power. And the other, give me a minute, I'll remember what it was. What were we talking about? The fact that shipping this waste from our luxurious golf course laden communities to somebody else's backyard is an environmental injustice. So it's an environmental justice issue. And we're trying to get that across. That Everywhere you turn in the nuclear fuel chain, it's a violation of environmental justice principles. Everything from the mining, which takes place on indigenous lands all over the world. You know, the Dene in New Mexico, the Lakota in Colorado and South Dakota, the Cree in Canada, the Tuareg in Niger, the Aborigines in Australia, the Central European tribes where this uranium stuff is. Those communities are clobbered. Mill tailings piles. So our fuel cycle now wants to redump this crap on them. You know, we already got them at the front end. Let's get them at the back end too, right? Ship all the waste down to those communities again too, right? So those are the two considerations. Nuclear power is an environmental justice up front. And one of the ways to cure it is just like what we are attempting to do with fossil fuels. You must have just transitions in place, and you must have it before a plant closes. Because if you don't, there's going to be slippage later, and then the communities are going to get screwed, just like Zion got screwed. In fact, that was one of the things we recommended to the legislators. Is don't listen to Dave Kraft. Invite Al Hill, the former mayor of Zion, or Billy McKinney, the current mayor of Zion, to come and talk to you about what it means to be mayor of a community that got screwed by the nuclear industry. So,
It's a ghost town. There's not
well, they
much
haven't been
there.
invited yet. So.
Yeah.
But I did get Al out to Washington, D.C. for a congressional hearing. So they're willing to listen to him. But, anyway. So, that's where we're at this point, Sandy, is it's at the reactor sites, in the swimming pools or in the canisters, no place to go, no forward-thinking plan except to make money off of it and make it somebody else's problem.
And it just keeps adding up.
And we just keep adding to it. Years ago, I put this into my presentations. I grew up in Chicago. Anybody else? You're sports? Okay, a couple of us. I was hanging around Oak Street Beach when they were building the John Hancock building. Any of you too? Just so happens, the same time that they were building John Hancock was when they were building the first reactors. And it occurred to me many years later, what if they built the Hancock building with no bathrooms? Figured out. But they built a nuclear industry without them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tom Jasinski,
Tom, thank you.
give me an honest answer about how long you have to store nuclear waste. How long? How many thousands of years, in your opinion?
It's not an opinion. They've done the mathematical calculations showing that some of this waste, and I'll have to explain why I say that, will be hazardous for beyond 250,000 years, maybe 500,000 years in some cases. And here's why. In the reactors now, and probably in these small modulars too, if they get built, we have big atoms of uranium. And the whole deal is that you bombard those atoms with neutrons. And what happens if they're just the right energy, the right speed, the right angle, it'll hit the big uranium atom and break it apart. And when it does that, it creates smaller pieces, and it creates more neutrons, and it creates heat. The only thing we want in that equation is the heat, because all a nuclear power plant is a very expensive, specialized, money-losing tea kettle. All we want is the heat, to boil water, to make steam, to drive a turbine, to run a generator. That's it. Coal plants burn coal, gas plants burn gas, nuclear plants fission uranium. Now sometimes though, instead of the neutrons splitting apart and making smaller chunks, which are called fission products, those are lighter than uranium, but most of those are very radioactive, very intensely radioactive for shorter periods of time. Sometimes the neutrons are just a little too sluggish or whatever, and they get captured. But in the process, they change the uranium into a different element completely by creating a proton and an energy source, usually a beta electron. And that changes them from the Irish O'Neills to, the Stewarts. That's what happens. It's alchemy. It's the alchemist's stone. So the neutrons get captured, and uranium becomes plutonium, becomes americium, becomes neptunium, and a lot of what they call transuranics, which are heavier than uranium. Those are radioactive too, But most of those are really slow about it, okay? They will eventually break apart over time into smaller chunks, and this is where it gets complicated. And this is why I can't answer your question directly. When you put the fresh fuel into the reactor, it's all uranium. When you take it out, it's 1,000,000 times more radioactive than it went in, first of all, because of all of this alchemy going on. And there are hundreds of new created materials that weren't there before because of this splitting apart or this absorbing, making new materials. And all of those are radioactive. The problem is each one of them has a different lifespan. Some of them have lifespans of microseconds, but some of them have lifespans of millions of years. So all of this is in the radioactive waste, which we call spent fuel. It's clearly not spent, it's more radioactive than it was. And that's the problem of dealing with it, because I've actually seen some of these charts. They do a lifespan chart. It has to be logarithmic because it's so long. Because what happens is you will see heat and radiation going down at first. No, that's good. You want that. Then all of a sudden you'll see a spike here. What's that spike? Oh, this element decayed and it created these other materials which are more radioactive. And then they go away. And then you go out a little farther. And there's another one. Well, it turns out, if I'm going on memory on this one, I could be wrong. You could check it with the Argon people. Somewhere in the order of 200,000 years out to 400,000 years out, you have the biggest spikes of radiation in the whole process. So, it's, as you can see, it's not a simple answer. But the point is, because of where all these different spikes come at different times, we clearly have to keep it out of the environment, just from the radiation standpoint. The other problem, and those of you who are familiar with GNEP know this, that spent fuel, there have been proposals to take it, dissolve it in acid, and through different processes, call out selectively the ones you want to use for other things. And one of the things you might want them to be used for are bombs. It's called reprocessing. And the British do it, the French do it, the Russians do it, the Japanese tried it and got burned figuratively and metaphorically. It's an expense, it's polluting, and it's a proliferation risk. So, and that is one other piece that we're suspicious of with that Holtec scheme in central interim storage, is that if these folks get a concentration of spent fuel, they're going to make a pitch for reprocessing again. More money in it. So I tried to answer the question as accurately as I could, certainly not to your satisfaction, but I did the best I could.
You can round it off to 1,000,000 years.
Something like that, you know. When the Cubs win their next World Series.
As common citizens, what can we do to prevent this?
Oh, nothing.
Well, not to prevent it, but like, what can we do? I camp up in Zion a lot.
Oh,
Right,
when I was a Boy Scout, I used to.
right next to
Beautiful
the
park.
nuclear part, the
Gorgeous.
power plant. So can I take water samples? Would that make a difference, you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't go to that level of elaboration. There's a lot of reasons for that we could talk offline about. But what can we do? I mean, one of our mottos for 40 years has been, don't just do something, stand there. And what we mean by that is, you know, first rule of holes. What is it? All together. When you find yourself in a hole,
Stop digging.
thank you, louder.
Stop digging.
Stop digging. That's how fundamental we have to get with this, at least with the legislator here. Now, I only poked a little bit at the Biden administration. It's only because my club isn't big enough, because they're a bunch of idiots at this point on nuclear stuff. But they are definitely one of the most pro-nuclear administrations we've ever had, and they are, you know, into giving them all kinds of money. And one of the biggest proponents of giving money to the nuclear industry in Congress right now is, guess who? Anybody? Initials JM. Federal, think federal. JM. Think W, Virginia.
Joe Manchin.
Joe Manchin. Yeah. So, you know, when the slime of the earth are big proponents of an industry, we have our work cut out for us. So one of the first things I would recommend is get out your pitchforks and your torches. And we got to raise a whole lot of hell in a qualitatively different way. But, you know, as long as we are into this notion of don't look up, this notion of we can incrementally do it, a little bit here, a little bit there, change your light bulb, recycle your plastic bags, we're doomed. We have to think bigger, we have to think tougher, and we have to stop being so goddamn polite. This is